Hello eye-tracking community, my name is Michael and in this video we will talk about why do you want to conduct an eye-tracking experiment, what metrics do you want to analyze and how the experiment will look like. If you're interested in the single parts about why, what and how, please have a look into this description. There you will find the links to the videos, or please have a look into the playlist here on the top. In this first part, we will talk about why do you want to conduct an eye-tracking experiment. Eye-tracking is and can be used in many different fields, like cognitive science, psychology, usability research, automotive, aviation, market research, sports science, medical tech, and many more. If you're a scientist, your goal is to create knowledge. If you are a researcher or engineer in the industry, your reasons why you want to conduct eye-tracking experiments might be more practical. Like you want to test the concepts of a user interface, or you want to collect data for training AI algorithms. If you are a market researcher, you might be interested in why customers are preferring one product instead of another. So the reasons why we are conducting eye-tracking experiments can be very different. So there are many different applications where we are using eye-tracking. For beginners, it often looks like that all these different applications fields have their own challenges when you want to conduct, when you want to design, when you want to analyze eye-tracking experiments. And that the effort for designing, for conducting and for analyzing these experiments is very high. In this video, I will guide you through the design of an eye-tracking experiment by following the 3 questions. Why do you want to conduct an eye-tracking experiment? What metrics do you want to analyze? And how the final experiment will look like. And by watching this tutorial, you will be able to create a successful eye-tracking experiment, producing data in a high quality and great results. In many times, eye-tracking is combined with other sensor data, like EEG, ECG or EMG, just to name a few. This means eye-tracking is combined with the recording of the brain activity, with the heartbeat activity, and with muscular activity. So why means where do you come from and where do you want to go with eye tracking? Are there any restrictions? For example, deadlines because of paper writing, paper submitting? Are there deadlines in a project? Are there restrictions with the budget? All these aspects are important for choosing a subsection of the metrics in step 2 and for designing the experiment afterwards. From my experience, the best way for getting an overview about why you want to conduct the eye-tracking experiment is to write the reasons down on a sheet of paper. The good thing with this paper is that after you have selected your metrics, after you have designed your experiment, you have conducted it and finally analyzed it, you can come back, you can read the reasons, you can compare the results with the why question at the beginning to learn something and to make things better in the next study. So if you know now why you want to conduct an eye-tracking experiment, it's a good time to ask the next question. What metrics do you want to analyze? We will match now your reasons with the metrics. The basic concept of an experiment is the following. We manipulate the independent variables and we try to control the co-founding variables as best as we can. This is not only true for user experiments. This process is being used in almost every scientific experiment. And this approach is called controlled user experiment. Most times the goal is to find correlations between the eye movements and other information. Correlation means we are looking for the relationship between 2 or more variables. In a user experiment, we can record different information about the participants. There is the eye tracking data and all the information we can derive from that. But there's also some information from biometric sensors. We have information about the participants, so like age, gender, experience. We have information about the environment and about the context, so for example from logging files. So the possibilities are endless here. But let's come back now to eye tracking and to the question, what metrics do you want to analyze? When we're looking into the literature, we will find many different metrics we can analyze. So, for example, the total gaze duration and the normalized gaze duration, the average gaze duration, maximum and minimum gaze duration, and the gaze count, the time to first fixation gazed at by time, the fixation count, the saccade count, the average fixation duration, the average saccade duration, the average saccade length, the fixation rate, the fixation saccade time ratio, the scan path length, the scan path duration, the scan path area, and the AOI transition rate, just to name a selection out of the reference literature here. The important point here is you have to make a decision which subsection of all these possible metrics you want to analyze after recording your eye movements. And for defining this subsection, it is very important to know why you want to conduct your eye tracking experiment. Based on the answer or the answers why you want to conduct your eye tracking experiment are the analysis methods you want to use or you have to use for analyzing your data. Because, for example, some statistical methods need a specific distribution of the data. So, for example, there are some statistic tests which require a Gaussian or normal distribution of your recorded data. And for checking if there is a normal distribution of your data, you have to insert some special statistical tests to find out if there is a normal distribution or not before you go into the analysis with your statistical methods. Another aspect is which metrics are delivered in a good quality from the experiment. So, for example, you find out that only gaze points are recorded in a good quality, and for whatever reasons the fixation detection algorithm is not working correctly and you cannot compute fixations based on the gaze points. If this is the case, you have to know that gaze points do not represent the visual perception of a scene. They represent the way the hardware is measuring, is recording our eye movements. Then you have to ask yourself, can I or do I want to continue with this data so that I'm only using gaze points as the basic metric, so I cannot go further or cannot analyze in detail fixation metrics? Or do I have to change the experimental setup or the procedure of the experiment? But from my experience, the best solution is to create a comprehensive data foundation right during the experiment and to record as many different data types as possible already during the experiment. And that's why it is so important to know the reasons of your eye tracking experiment and the restrictions of your experiment. These reasons and the restrictions due to the number of participants, the hardware setup, or the time you can invest in your eye tracking experiment give you the framework for your data quality and the metrics you can and you want to analyze afterwards. Don't be afraid too much about all the challenges here. From my experience, there are a few points which you have really to take into account for generating data in a good quality and for conducting a very well eye tracking experiment. Please have a look at one of our previous videos about gaze points, saccades and scan paths for a short introduction into these basic metrics. And about all the other metrics which I've shown you here a minute ago, we will do a separated video in this channel. Let's come now to the last step. You know now why you want to conduct an eye tracking experiment and which metrics you want to analyze. In this video, we will talk now about the concrete steps of the eye tracking experiment. Basically, you can work with two different setups. The first one is that you control as many co-founding or dependent variables as you can. This means that you're doing a lab experiment, or you're doing a more open experiment like in a real-world scenario. From my experience, in both cases, it makes sense to work with several steps during the design process. And one tip for beginners: keep it as simple as possible. So please do not start with 50 participants, multi-webcams, 30 or 50 stimuli, EEG and eye tracking. The probability is very high that you will be frustrated and that you don't get the data in the quality you want to get. In general, the basic procedure of an eye tracking experiment is the following. After being greeted, the participants fill out a questionnaire about their demographic data. And they also indicate whether they have knowledge in the field about the task. By filling out this questionnaire and analyzing the results, we can minimize the influence of co-founding variables in the experiment. Next, the participants perform an eye test. In my experiments, I've used a Snellen chart for testing the acuity of their vision, and I've used the Ishihara color charts for testing the color vision. The third step, the participants get a short introduction to the task. This introduction should be given in writing form or as a video. And then they can ask any questions about the task at hand to the experimenter. And this ensures that all the participants perform their tasks with the same level of knowledge. Before the subject's eye movements are recorded, the eye tracking device has to be calibrated. And this can be done several times during the experiment. Then, in the fifth step, the presentation of the stimuli begins and the participants perform their tasks. Several task blocks are performed in the experiment. The participants is given the possibility to have breaks in order to relax. And during these breaks, the participants can fill out questionnaires like the NASA Task Load Index. And then the next task block begins with the same procedure as described in the fourth or fifth step. And finally, if necessary, the participants can fill out a final questionnaire at the end of the experiment and can get a compensation for their participation. From my experience and what I did during my studies, these are the important steps of an eye tracking experiment. Now let's talk about the restrictions due to the budget and the requirements. First, you should ask who should participate in your eye tracking experiment. So the question is here about the participant selection. In some user experiments, the participant is the independent variable. And this means that you want to analyze correlations between the eye movements and characteristics of the participants, such as gender, age, and their experience in doing the task. So the next question which you should ask yourself is, how should the stimuli look like? And please do not underestimate the time which you have to invest to create appropriate stimuli. These stimuli can be either static stimuli like images or photos. They can be dynamic like a video or a VR scene or a website. Last question. What kind of eye tracker system do you want to use to record the eye movements? You can choose between two different systems. The first one is a fixed eye tracker, sometimes also called desktop eye tracker. And the other one is a head-mounted eye tracker, which allows the participants to move freely through their environment. Both systems have advantages and disadvantages. For a more detailed descriptions of these two different systems and how they are working, please have a look at one of our previous videos. So two things are now left. The first thing is, please do pilot studies before you run the real experiment. In a pilot study, you can test your equipment, your setup, your procedure with a small group of participants. And you can do these pilot studies or run through the pilot study several times until you reach a level where you say, okay, now I'm ready for the real experiment. And these pilot studies help you to avoid that something is going wrong with the real experiment later if you have invited all the 30, 50, 100 participants to your lab. So finally, let's talk about the most tricky part from my experience when conducting an eye tracking experiment or when designing an eye tracking experiment. It's the question, how much participants do you want to invite and how much stimuli do you want to use for your experiment? So let's assume, due to your statistical methods, you need a certain amount of data points, let's say several thousand data points. Then you could say, okay, I invite now 30 participants. I will show them in 3 task blocks 30 stimuli each. And if you multiply all these numbers, this will lead to 2,700 single data sets or scan paths which you have to record during your eye tracking experiment. And when you're now measuring how much time you need for presenting these single stimuli, you will get the overall time for recording the eye movements. And then you have to add the introduction as well as when you're saying goodbye and farewell to your participants. And this is then the overall time for the whole experiment, together with setting up and then with shutting down the, for example, eye tracking hardware. And it's not only about running these experiments, it's also analyzing these experiments. And to make a long story short, this was my motivation why I started to do research in the field of visual analytics for eye tracking, to analyze this amount of data in a very efficient way. So here we are now at the end of this series of tutorials. From my experience in the last 13 years in eye tracking research, most times it's the best way to think the whole design process of an eye tracking experiment from the perspective of the end, from the analysis. So what difference do you want to find when you when you are analyzing your eye movements? Which correlations do you want to find? And going from there backwards through the setup to the beginning in combination with the question, why do you want to conduct your eye tracking experiment, shows you the path to design a great eye tracking experiment, which hopefully will provide you a real good data quality for your work. Thanks for watching this series. I hope that you now better understand the process of setting up an eye tracking experiment. If you liked the video, please press the like button and share it with your community.